Everyone, how are you this afternoon? It is noon here in Chicago. We imagine we're all coming from different places, so we're at different time zones. But welcome to Crossing Latinidades, Climate and Environmental Justice. This is a project that involved 3 universities and 5 different sites of research. We have been working now for a couple of years in this wonderful collaboration that included us here at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm Teresa Cordova. I'm director of the Great Cities Institute here at UIC, along with Rosa Cabrera, Ralph Cintrón, and Rachel Haverlock. In addition, we have from University of Texas, Arlington, Ariadna Reyes Sanchez, and from University of California, Irvine, Michael Mendez. We've had a wonderful collaboration over the last couple of years. This is part of Crossing Latinidades, which is a project that was funded by the Mellon Foundation. We received our funding directly from the project. And during that time, we were very interested in looking at how do Latino communities experience, cope, and contest the disparate impacts of pollution and extreme climate change events. You will see that we have varied lens through which we are looking at this question, and we are primarily thinking about it from a humanities point of view, but you will see as I present each of the faculty members, they will share with you their different methodologies and the different sites in which they examine this issue. So the format for today is that each of the presenters will speak from about 5 to 7 minutes, introducing you to the site and to the project. And then we're going to have conversation among ourselves on what we learned, addressing 3 primary questions. How does climate change exacerbate the current inequalities experienced by vulnerable Latino communities? How does climate change reveal common concerns and create opportunities across geographically and contextually diverse Latino communities? And thirdly, how can researchers more effectively work with local communities on these issues? So with that, let me first turn it over to Ariadna Reyes Sanchez, who will be our first presenter.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much. My name is Ariadna Reyes. Today, I will talk about climate justice, sustainability, and the informal city, and a case study of Springville, a multiracial unincorporated community in North Texas that help us provide a new understanding of the interactions between these issues. Our research helped us build a model that uncovered 128 peripheral communities experience high levels of housing informality in Dallas County that I highlight in red. Our research expands literature of informality in the US that primarily focus on the US-Mexico borderlands. By uncovering informal subdivisions in North Texas, our research reveals the significance of informal communities in the United States as a widespread phenomenon that requires the attention of planners, community development stakeholders, and Latino studies. Because data on unincorporated communities and peripheral informal subdivisions is poorly collected or lacks disaggregation, our research requires us to conduct extensive participatory action research over the last 3 years using humanistic methodologies such as photo voice or oral histories to document environmental injustices in the community of Springville. Our research helps us build relationships of trust with residents and stakeholders assisting the community and understand the history of this community, which was founded in 1878 by African-American residents as a freedmen town. However, it has been unincorporated by the Dallas County over time. In 2003, a FEMA designation of the community as a floodplain area enabled the selective enforcement of restrictions and regulations that led to the massive demolition of the existing housing stock and the displacement of most of the original residents. However, in the last 2 decades, new residents of all races, predominantly Latino residents, moved to the community in search for affordable housing. As a resident of Springville stated in his oral voice, this is the only community in Dallas that lacks everything: water, sewage, trash pickup, street lighting, paved roads, internet, all the things. Despite the disproportionate environmental injustices experienced by residents of unincorporated communities in the country, residents develop coping strategies that are sustainable and are worth examining by planners. So they use alternative water systems, such as rudimentary wells that people self-build or water tanks. However, rudimentary wells that were built in the 60s are not always operational, and well water is poor quality for human consumption. So many residents rely on water tanks that they have to purchase, increasing their water burdens. Because they don't have sewage disposal, they develop coping strategies such as building a septic tank, or some residents simply dispose gray water on the soil. We found that some Latino residents use their previous experiences in Mexico to develop latrines, as one resident expressed in his oral interview. Also, we found that 70% of the community members burn trash because of the lack of solid pickup services provided by the county. But they do out of necessity, as one resident expressed in their interview. If we do not burn trash, we will have accumulations of waste, which leads to animals and burning. And also we found that 12% of the residents pay for expensive trash pickup, highlighting the burdens of residents of unincorporated communities in the country. We also found sustainable scrapping and recycling practices, as 50% of the residents separate trash to take advantage of materials that they scrap to make a living because of the lack of jobs opportunities. Some residents grow their own food and raise animals to address their food insecurities. And also they are exposed to energy injustices associated with housing precarity, but also to the lack of access to technologies and appliances. 60% use a hot plate to cook, and 34% use alternative systems for water heating, such as the use of a water resistance or resistencia eléctrica. Also, street lights are not existent, so residents build their own light poles to address their lighting needs at night. And we believe that the lack of resilient infrastructure and services provided by the city increase a disproportionate exposure to climate events. We found that residents of this community haven't been able to recover from the 2021 winter storm. So for example, Betty had a tree fall on her roof, and she's concerned about the roof's condition. In her oral history, she expressed, "My roof is rotten and will likely fall down. I'm mostly concerned about the winter and how I will survive cold temperatures in my house." Interestingly, only 20% of the residents experience floods, questioning the floodplain designation from FEMA. However, residents are exposed to environmental racism as they are mounting illegal dumping in the community, as you can see in the picture taken by a resident, which exacerbate their exposure to extreme climate events during the summer, when heat waves frequently occur and ignite wildfires. And you can also see the inability of the firefighters to put off the fire because of the lack of pipe water in the community. So overall, we want to offer implications for planning policy that may enlighten some solutions. So we believe that participatory action research and humanistic methodologies are useful methods to understand environmental justice in vulnerable communities, that US planners can also learn from other policies enacted in the Global South, such as participatory slum operating policies that enable the engagement of residents and community-based organizations. And planners should build on residents' coping solutions and ignite environmental justice movements in these communities. I also want to thank Josh Newton, Dr. Josh Newton from University of California at San Diego, and PhD candidate Bernardo Vargas, who were also Crossing Latinidades fellows and were my research partners in this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariadna. Professor Reyes Sanchez. People might be wondering where are they going to be able to get more information on her project. One of the things that we're going to do once everyone has spoken is we're going to launch our website through which you'll be able to get access to more information on each of these projects. But let me go next to California. Professor Mendez, tell us about fires and climate change.
Great. Thank you, Teresa and UIC for your leadership over the last 2 years or so. It's been a pleasure to work with you and provide this human scale approach to climate-induced disasters. As it was mentioned earlier, my research focuses on the disparate health and socioeconomic impacts of climate-induced disasters on some of the most marginalized and stigmatized populations, undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants, primarily here in California. In addition to my Mellon Foundation funding, my studies have been supported by the National Science Foundation Early Faculty Career Award through the Innovators Program of the National Center for Atmospheric Research and the Andrew Carnegie Corporation. And so this convergence research, as you'll see later in our website, entails data mapping, air quality modeling, archival research, and interviews with migrant workers and advocates and policymakers as well. But today I'm going to primarily be focusing on the storytelling interviews with advocates for these migrant survey organizations through a short documentary video that we did. And it's quite important to kind of highlight this issue today because as we've seen from the recent elections, that undocumented migrants during disasters were used to be scapegoats and vilify and unduly provide misinformation that undocumented immigrants are getting federal disaster relief aid. But it's quite apparent, as you will see in this video, that there's explicit federal exemptions and often even at the state level and local level that prohibit providing direct disaster services to undocumented migrants. So again, here we're going to be providing the human scale story. So I'll show a few minutes of that video. Whose lives get priority before, during, and after a disaster? When climate-induced disasters such as wildfires or heat waves strike, they don't affect everyone equally. Every aspect of a disaster, including vulnerabilities, preparedness, response, and recovery, is to some extent a social calculus. Systemic racism, cultural norms regarding U.S. citizenship, and assumptions about who is considered a worthy disaster victim often blinds policymakers and disaster relief organizations to the unique needs of undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. Because undocumented migrants fall outside these norms, they often are treated as less than human or even disposable. These conditions directly shape disaster response and climate adaptation policies. For undocumented migrant farm workers in particular, the promise of a better life often collides with the harsh realities of systemic inequalities. Undocumented migrants are struggling to survive in a region of wealth and prosperity, and they are the invisible populations living and working behind the bougainvillea curtain. This idiom references the fast-growing evergreen vine with an explosive magenta color adorning the gates of mansions and vineyards for added privacy. For example, in recent fires, the economic impact of smoke taint it's estimated to have cost the California wine industry over $3.7 billion. Smoke taint occurs when smoke and ash permeate the skin of grapes, which can affect the taste and smell of wine, making it unsellable.
However, too much concern is often placed on the economic impacts to the wine industry, but not on the farm workers that are harvesting grapes during wildfire events and how their lungs are also being tainted. They are not provided with adequate occupational health and safety protections, let alone hazard pay or federal disaster funds to work in mandatory evacuation zones considered hazardous to the general population. Making these inequalities visible is important because in California, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis. In the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, flooding, and of course the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequalities, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. In essence, disasters such as wildfires in California are not isolated events. They often now compound with other hazards and comorbidities, or what is called a syndemic in the field of public health. So now more than ever, it is crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms, particularly in the context of disaster impacts on undocumented Latino and indigenous migrants.
Think about all these things all the time, because I think it's one of those things, and part of like I was saying, a big picture or like planning. It's like, okay, we had COVID, the pandemic, but what could be next, and how do we prepare for that? Right here in Sonoma County, we've had fire season. Thankfully, this year we have had no fires, and it's been raining, which we're all so appreciative of. But also understanding that there could be another disaster, and how do we have a plan to jump into action? How do we make sure that we have our team ready to go and they feel supported and like emotionally ready to jump into emergency work again? And then also making sure that we're aware of like the areas where we still need to grow or we need to improve as an organization, as a team, to be able to reach more community members.
Our research illustrates the urgent need to recenter disaster policy and recovery efforts to include the most marginalized and stigmatized populations. One of the largest gaps in safeguarding communities from disasters is the federal exclusion of undocumented people from receiving disaster aid. Millions of Californians are undocumented, and disproportionately high numbers of them work in sectors that are severely affected by wildfires and other climate-induced disasters. Their families are especially vulnerable to disasters due to the lack of language access to emergency warnings, minimal economic resources to evacuate and rebuild homes, and lower rates of healthcare and home insurance coverage. In response, migrant organizations, community organizers, and coalitions have come together to address the problems faced by undocumented communities. With the lack of federal, state, and local support, they responded to a humanitarian crisis affecting some of California's most impoverished people by raising funds and providing direct disaster services. In particular, the needs of indigenous migrant workers and their families are often overlooked by government officials. California has hundreds of thousands of indigenous people from Mexico and Central America living and working in labor-intensive sectors such as row crops, cut flowers, and winemaking. Indigenous Mixtec, Triqui, Maya, and Chatino people are not Hispanic or Latino, though they are often grouped with Hispanic communities. Many are illiterate and some speak neither Spanish nor English, but only their native languages. This impedes their ability to obtain health care, housing, and education, to negotiate with employers to improve their work situation, and to exercise their basic civil rights. Climate-induced disasters are exacerbating these pre-existing inequalities.
Great, thank you for this opportunity. We'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about policy recommendations to move forward with this community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendez. That's so interesting and so powerful. I look forward to getting into the conversation, not only among us, but to involve our attendees with any questions or comments that they may have as well. All right, we were in Texas, then we were in California. Now let's come back to Illinois. Rosa Cabrera, I know that you and Natalie and the crew over there at the Latino Cultural Center have been doing many, many innovative things, and we have been so glad that you have been part of this Present Latinidades project. That your participation has really elevated a lot of our conversations. So with that, let me turn it over to you, and I think you're going to introduce Natalie. Yes.
Thank you, Teresa, and welcome everyone from Chicago. Yes, Natalie will be sharing the PowerPoint, and she will also be talking about the research that we conducted here at the Latino Cultural Center. You can go to the next slide. So our study aims to better understand how Latinx communities have endured, confronted, or adapted to systematic environmental injustices, including pollution and extreme climate events. We focus on the Chicago context and included some of its surrounding suburban areas. Just to give you a little context here, in Chicago, Black and Latinx residents are more likely to live near industrial pollution and in one of the city's environmental racism hotspots, where climate change threats are exacerbated by air, water, and land pollution. This is largely in relation to a legacy of residential segregation that have created and sustained inequitable living conditions by zip code. The majority of industrial corridors are located in working class Black and Latina communities in the city. And this is what you're looking at the map on my right-hand side. We have 6 recognized sacrifice zones, which are residential areas on the southwest and far south side of the city that are burdened by industrial pollution at hazardous rates. And these are Algen Garden, Little Village, McKinley Park, Pilsen, Southeast Side, and the region along the Calumet River. And what you see in the map is you see how the sacrifices zones overlap some of the industrial corridors. The methodology that we use to get our data, we use a mixed method approach that included visual ethnography. We collected 63 sets of personal maps and artworks alongside written stories created by Latinx participants who we call storytellers. 45 of those residents live in Chicago, 28 live in sacrifice zones and or nearby the sacrifice zones, and 18 from suburban areas. We also did extensive participant observation, which generated a lot of field notes. And we also included demographic surveys. There were a total of 7 research sessions conducted with 5 partners listed below, which facilitated, each of them facilitated the opening of their doors in their sites, but also they help us recruited the storytellers. And for each session, we had a researcher or 2 of the researchers alongside a local artist who help us collect this, what we call story maps. For the Latino Cultural Center, we focus on recruiting UIC Latinx students. The next, so as we gather this data, the study disclosed a series of residents' concerns, attitudes, and assets that serve to organize the findings into the following central theme. Recognizing the critical intersection of environmental and social justice, underscoring who the real polluters are and demanding accountability, and finally, placekeeping and activating cultural assets. So as we move along the findings, we will discuss those within those 3 themes. But before we do that, we also underscore two awareness factors that we need to talk about because those cross over the different themes. The first is the storyteller's perception about racial disparities and environmental racism. And the second is their familiarity with environmental challenges, including climate change. So the key takeaway points from these two core awareness factors on the racial disparities that storytellers recognize the city legacy of industrial pollution and the pollutant contaminating the air, water, and soil. You will see an example of two of the maps or drawings that we collected with the stories that the storytellers wrote about those particular artwork. The storytellers also understand that environmental hazards and climate change impacts individuals differently depending on their residential location. And we saw a more blunt articulation of racial disparities in the city from storytellers who were young adults. As far as climate change awareness, the storytellers express general awareness about climate change, which they recognize typically by observing extreme changes in weather, seasons, and nature, while mentioning catastrophic impacts like heat, drought, flooding, and crop failings in a broader setting. They typically saw climate change in relation to environmental pollution and how the latter was exacerbating climate change. And finally, storytellers, especially those with recent immigrant backgrounds, understand the impacts of climate change through their transnational connections. For example, Latin American countries and Chicago. They also express a very strong sense of responsibility toward the environment. Nat, I think you now are going to do the next 3 slides.
Yes, there we go. Sorry, the PowerPoint's being a little tricky. Okay, thank you, Rosa. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalia Ayala, and I was the research assistant on the Chicago Latina Voices Project, working alongside Dr. Cabrera. And I'm going to go a bit more in depth to the 3 central themes that were mentioned previously. And so throughout the project, we were able to identify 3 central themes that emerged from the maps and the storytelling sessions. While many of the stories shared can definitely overlap in terms of theme and should not be understood in isolation from one another, for the sake of the project, we did categorize them into 3 main themes. And so our first theme was recognizing the critical intersection of environmental and social justice. And so throughout the project, many of the stories provided insights on how environmental problems, including climate change, are connected across multiple social issues. This included labor, immigration, mental health, and among other things. And so our key takeaway points from this section was 1, health surfaced as a significant concern and was always linked to environmental pollution for our folks living within and outside of sacrifice zones in Chicago and in the suburban areas. 2, storytellers described with precision the pollutants in their communities and how these were impacting the health of not only themselves, but their families and their local communities. And they also highlighted the detrimental effects on their mental health, often describing feelings of anxiety, hopelessness, and fear about the impending future. And there was also the loss of gratitude and connection with nature surfaced as a prominent concern among specifically immigrant storytellers, making them determined to teach their children and their local communities about respecting nature. And so on this right-hand side, we have 2 story maps that included the visual map that storytellers created, but also their written story that was connected to that as well. And so our next central theme was understanding who the real polluters are and demanding accountability. And so we saw storytellers who lived in environmentally burdened areas were extremely aware of who the polluters in their neighborhoods were. And so the key takeaway points we saw here were 1, they were rejecting individual blame for the climate crisis and blaming the industries in their neighborhoods for polluting and exacerbating climate change. So we really saw this move away from this individualized, I'm not going to use a plastic straw, and moving more towards these large polluters are moving into our community, and how do we hold them accountable? And so our second point to that was the storytellers often offset the harmful environmental conditions in their neighborhoods with the positive things that residents are doing or aiming to do so. And then our third point under this theme was storytellers expressed frustration with the lack of respect they receive not only from the polluters coming into their communities, but also city officials here in Chicago. And so again, we have the similar format. On the right-hand side, we have two maps along with their stories. And so in our third central theme, here we really focused on placekeeping and activating cultural assets. And so in our three main takeaway points, one, we really saw storytellers expressing significant concerns about community loss and displacement due to the ongoing expansion of environmental pollutants in their neighborhood, aggravating further harms to the community. Two, they recognize that their cultural assets and natural heritage often suffer both under direct and indirect impacts as a result of environmental injustices and more broadly climate injustices. And then our third point here is storytellers deployed a wide range of cultural assets to resist further environmental damage in their neighborhoods, such as sustaining a sense of place or belonging, where we often refer to this as placekeeping, and revitalizing environmentally friendly practices from their homelands. So we were in particularly speaking to a lot of folks who are coming from Latin American countries, which was significant among our immigrant storytellers. And also, we also heard a lot of storytellers just talking about their ability of getting involved in local environmental justice advocacy, getting connected with the local organizations and their communities that have been doing this work, not only recently, but also for decades, and also embracing a holistic community wellness approach where people are taking care of not only the people in their community, but also the environment and their built environments. And so these were the three main themes that we came to throughout this project. And now I'm actually going to pass it over back to Rosa, who's going to go over our concluding points.
Yeah, just for the sake of time, I think we need the next one, the concluding point, Natalie. Just for the sake of time, we're just going to get across these two main points here. Conceptions and framing of climate change. The climate change is understood as an environmental and social justice issue. And that in the context of their daily life, climate change is often paired with environmental pollution and feeding off each other. So very rarely we saw people talking about climate change on its own. It was always alongside environmental pollution. And then the last one is the community and household adaptation strategy. This is what Natalie was mentioning in the last slide, which is the way that communities who are being affected are deploying a wide range of cultural and community assets to resist further environmental damage in a very creative ways, right? This sustaining a sense of place of belonging, what we come to call placekeeping, which includes preserving cultural and natural heritage, revitalizing environmental friendly practices, which of course, you know, this was very predominant among immigrant communities, getting involved in advocacy alongside environmental justice leaders, and then, you know, embracing a holistic community wellness approach that took care of people in the environment. So just thank you so much. I think there is one last slide. So this one, you will have access to the an interactive story map report and full report that I think at the end, Teresa mentioned that we're going to have it.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Yeah. Let me go ahead and keep us moving here and get us to our next presenter. That was really interesting. But we want to also make sure we allow for some conversation and some Q&A. Folks have already been putting into the Q&A section. They've been putting in some questions and getting them answered. So we encourage you to do that as well. But again, thank you. But you can see already how rich the variation is on the types of methodologies that people are using. Rachel Haverlock, let me turn to you, Professor Haverlock, Director of the Freshwater Lab. She and I were the leads on this particular piece of this collaboration. So if I can turn over to you, Professor Haverlock.
Thank you so much, Professor Cordova, who was my partner in this project. I also want to thank the Great Cities Institute and the Backward River team at my freshwater lab that helped with this work. And it fits very nicely with what Natalie and Rosa presented about environmental justice communities in Chicago. We focused in on these communities that live alongside waterways or rivers in the state of Illinois. And we focused here for two reasons. One, because with climate change, we are seeing radical shifts in the nature of water and the ways people are experiencing water. We have communities that are alternately confronted with drought conditions, and then that can swing and pivot into extreme rainfall and even flooding events. And these fluctuating conditions means that water and access to water is becoming increasingly valuable and important. But our question really was, with this increased focus and attention to water, to what degree is this changing or not changing environmental practices? And so, referring back to Rosa and Natalie's map of Chicago's industrial corridors, we started focusing in on these corridors that are alongside these waterways. And just very quickly, I'm sure many on the call know, but here I'm introducing you also to something called the Chicago Area Waterway System, which contains two major rivers turned into canals. And yes, you're hearing it right, forced to run backward. So there's a very interesting transnational connection here, because these rivers, the Calumet and Chicago, which once meandered into Lake Michigan, now source water from Lake Michigan and carry the wastes of the Chicago metropolis down the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico. So again, as we heard from Rosa's brilliant presentation, Chicago has 26 designated industrial corridors and 15 planned manufacturing districts that are deliberately located near waterways, railways, and highways. And each of these paths reinforces a system of commodity transfer, which is inscribed into the landscape, reinforced through infrastructure, and has tremendous impacts on daily life. So quickly, planned manufacturing districts, first designated in the 1980s to try to keep industry in Chicago, are zoning districts. Industrial corridors, first designated in 1992, are a planning designation, and it's a planning designation that extends fewer protections and offers the city more flexibility in considering new non-industrial development and investment. Said otherwise, these industrial corridors have different standards of air and water quality than other parts of the city. So it means, right, in a measurable way, residents in these communities are exposed to worse air and worse water conditions. And the industrial corridor designation can also facilitate gentrification along with green gentrification. So this means that the heaviest burden of these new forms of industrialization falls on communities in Chicago's west and south side, with the far southeast and far west, southwest side alongside the Chicago and Calumet River disproportionately impacted. And these neighborhoods are largely working class and have high numbers of Latinx and African American residents. So again, we were looking at these industrial corridors in Little Village, Pilsen, McKinley Park, Bridgeport, Brighton Park neighborhoods, as well as on the southeast side of Chicago near the Calumet River and Lake Calumet. And at the same time that we were looking at this disproportionate burden, leaning on scholar Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence, a kind of a violence against communities that accrues over time and in multiple ways, we also wanted to look at the kind of environmental and environmental justice leadership that is percolating alongside these conditions. One kind of interesting reference, the kind of first special industrial zoning began in the 19th century around the time a very famous book about Chicago, The Jungle, was written. And The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, really kind of dramatizes the individual trial of a worker. And so kind of thinking about that individual response in that book, we wanted to turn to contemporary leaders who are leading the charge, addressing the conditions of these environmental corridors, along with leadership on cumulative impacts, air and water quality, and a just transition. Without further ado, let me turn to the promotional video of our panel of environmental justice leaders alongside Chicago's industrial corridors. Thank you, Edward.
The lived experiences of the communities that have been affected the most, especially the ones that have been taking the brunt of environmental racism.
You know, for 80 plus years, this site polluted the community, right?
There's been a 30-day hunger strike. There's been door knocking. There's been phone banking. I freaking ran for office. And yeah, like we have always been met with like immense resistance, even threats to our lives. It's crazy.
You put us on a map, and where is the biggest health inequalities? Where is the largest pollution? Where is the most impacted water that we're drinking? All of those things are the same maps. The injustice that we see is all root causes and systemic causes of racism and violence.
Chicago's always been a crucial region for the movement of goods, for trade, right? Going back to when indigenous peoples were here, we're between the two most important water systems in North America, Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. And water was our most important way of bringing goods into the central part of the country. The railroads followed, and a lot of that land that was formerly used for factories or for other heavy manufacturing was then replaced by logistics. We're all dealing with the impacts of that, right? And decisions that were made by our local and political leaders to embrace this new emerging economy and sacrifice certain communities in the process.
We started to work with institutions like UIC and other institutions to gather data, because the onus, like for us to like prove that there was a problem, that onus was on the community.
We started to mobilize. We put together some community meetings just to continue to, understand how was it that city governance completely failed the McKinley Park community in allowing this company to come in, once again, adjacent to our park, next door to schools, and 1,000 feet from residential homes. The city has about 24, 26 industrial corridors. They're being modernized, and they continue to redirect heavy industry into the southwest side, into the southeast side. And I think at the end of the day, the southeast side and the southwest side continue to become like the black lungs of the city's infrastructure.
And we have been continually pitted against each other. You have to choose. You want jobs or you want a clean neighborhood. You can't have both. That is untrue. Like, we actually have proof that if you do a just transition, if you have a sustainable economy, it will create more jobs.
So how do we create a vision, an economic framework for what our future could look like as we decarbonize our economy?
How do we engage the public? How do we get young folks like yourselves involved and engaged? The trust has been broken, but seeing the fire in your eyes and the radical work that you guys are doing to stand up for the right to breathe, the right to have good, clean drinking water, has motivated our generation to say, we got to get off our hands. We have got to stand up and stand together.
Absolutely.
Were you going to say anything else, Rachel? Okay, so as you saw, that was a promotional video, and the full video can be seen on the website, which we're about to launch here. Once we finish with our final speaker, Ralph Cintron. Ralph, as you're queuing up, one of the things I wanted to let people know about this project, one of the reasons that we did it is we really wanted to promote within Latino studies more of a focus and more of an interest on climate justice and the climate crisis. And one of the outcomes, the primary outcome of what we've done here is to provide material that can be used for curriculum in various classrooms, not only in our respective sites, but throughout the country. So our primary purpose, even in doing this website, was to help promote this topic, this issue, this set of issues within Latino studies itself. So with that, let me turn to Professor Ralph Cintron, who's providing yet another way to look at these issues. Professor.
Thank you very much, Teresa. My particular project was crossing Humboldt Park and Puerto Rico. And I believe I need to provide two kinds of contexts for this overall project. One is that there's a lot of science that is involved, and there's a lot of activism, particularly from the Puerto Rican community here in Chicago. The science part was part of a grant from the Department of Energy, $25 million grant, $5 million a year for 5 years. And the purpose of that grant was to measure climate inequalities in the city of Chicago. In other words, to gather data from different parts of the city and to see to what extent these different parts of the city were being hit by different kinds of climate events. Two of those sites were on the south side of Chicago, and the other site was on the northwest side of Chicago, and that's the area called Humboldt Park. Humboldt Park has been a long-standing site for the Puerto Rican community. I have been associated with the activists in that group or in that part of the city for about 2 decades or so. And the major characteristic over a number of decades, the main concern, let's say, has been what we sometimes call desplazamiento. In other words, gentrification. And what became so interesting after Hurricane Maria, and as we were discussing and sending some relief monies and other kinds of programming to Puerto Rico after that time, we began to realize that there was a kind of shared desplazamiento that linked Puerto Rico itself to Humboldt Park. Some of us have been thinking of Humboldt Park as a kind of, or a part of the archipelago, in fact, of Puerto Rico. I say that because there is a kind of constant movement of political interests that come from Humboldt Park to see if we can influence political relations in Puerto Rico. And by the same token, politicians coming or leaders coming, scientists coming to Humboldt Park. Anyway, so the crossing Humboldt Park and Puerto Rico is really about making sense of how climate change has been operating in 2 sites and trying to figure out the kind of convergence. So if we put together the Crocus explorations of climate, it turns out that the main lead of the Crocus initiative comes from Argonne National Laboratory. And they have a considerable amount of data regarding, interestingly enough, the sorts of changes which are beginning to materialize in Puerto Rico itself, And this is, as one might guess, increasing drought, increasing heat, increasing agricultural production. And those interests have become foregrounded now for the Humboldt Park folks as we think about some sort of initiatives and grant work and so on that might alleviate those conditions. In Puerto Rico, or excuse me, in Humboldt Park itself, interestingly enough, the data that we're beginning to pull out has a lot to do with heat as well. And what I'm going to try to do is to show you this particular screen share, if I can find it here, in which I can perhaps give you some idea of the different kinds of things which we're beginning to investigate and reveal. So I want to start here on the data for Humboldt Park. I'm going to open this up. And what you're going to see here are a set of maps in which we're gathering satellite data. And as a matter of fact, we're also involved right now in doing ethnographic work. But this is satellite data revealing heat around the city of Chicago. And if you start looking at some of the darker areas, and this I wanted to show you on the next page. So this is Humboldt Park. And the left side of what you're seeing there, the darker colors, we are recording now about 110 degrees. The lighter color on the far end of the spectrum to the right there is 107. Now, what's interesting to us, and I invite you, if you should open up this website, is that these designations, these differences in heat, correlate to differences in wealth and differences in ethnicity. In other words, white populations, let's say, are located more on the right side of the two maps that you're seeing here. I don't know if you can make that out, but this is also the area of Humboldt Park that is becoming gentrified. This area over here has still kind of resisted.
Ralph, I know you only have a couple of minutes left, but can you still make that a little bit larger? People are having.
I don't know that I can. Well, let me see.
Oh, it's the button that is
yeah. Does that help a little bit? I don't know.
It's actually the far right button that
button.
has the
That has the X. This one right here has the X. Way over here.
Yeah, the ones with the
Go in the
X
wrong
here.
direction, Ralph. The other direction. Far right. No, the other right. There you go.
That one. Yep.
There you go. Right there.
Perfect.
Okay.
There you
It
go.
still doesn't quite show it, but anyway.
That's
but yeah, you can at least begin to see the area on the right side of Humboldt Park there. That side, the blue area, the white area, all of that is cooler temperatures, by the way, and much higher property values. Again, as if you were to examine the data here, we have that data explicitly in terms of what the different property values are, renter versus home ownership, and so on and so on. All of that decreases when you move to the west part of Humboldt Park. Anyway, I'm going to kind of go back here. Nope, I'm going to go the other direction. I want to talk a little bit more about the sorts of things that we're doing then. So this is the sort of data that we've started to come up with. We're beginning to prove that gentrification, for instance, the sort of differences between ethnicity has a lot to do with tree canopies, has a lot to do with heat. And another aspect of our involvement in Humboldt Park has to do with curriculum. And there we're working quite a bit with a school called Albizu Campos Alternative High School, which interestingly enough right now is about 70% migrant population. And so what we've been trying to think about is how can we get all of this science data into the hands of students.
Ralph,
And so
Ralph, if I can there, I'm gonna actually, I want to, because there's some people are gonna possibly leave the webinar at 1.
Yeah,
And I
sure.
want to make sure that we launch the website. So I know you've got more to cover. I know you've covered your main,
Yeah,
but I
that's
know
fine.
you've got more to cover. And then there's more other comments that I want to ask other our other folks to comment on and respond to some of the questions that have come in. But but I do want to make sure that we've launched the website before the hour.
Yeah.
And we still have another 30 minutes to keep talking. So I'll come back to you. I'll
Yeah,
come back.
no
to
problem.
you.
No problem.
Edward, can you go ahead? As we said earlier on, that one of our purposes for today in this culmination of our 2 years plus work together across these universities and across these projects, this is a culminating moment for us. We wanted to share this information, make it available to you beyond this website, or beyond this webinar rather, to put it into a quasi-permanent spot via our website. So with that, let us officially launch the website of the Crossing Latinidades project. Go ahead and share that, Edward, if you can, on the screen itself. If you can, you've got the landing page, but if you can actually go to it, Lara, maybe I'll go to it. Can you all see that? And if you can, let's see. I want to.
Oh, I can go ahead to share the screen, Teresa.
I do.
Oh, okay, you got it. Okay, perfect.
What are you guys seeing here?
It has
Are you seeing the website?
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so here it is. Here's the website for you. There's the summary, and there's the 3 major questions that we asked across these 3 projects, or these rather 5 projects. And then you see the themes that we've covered: the Latino studies towards transdisciplinary climate research and methods, some of the ways in which we approach this, the fact that it was people-centered approaches to climate change, that we have emerging intersections of environmental and social justice and climate change. And so you can see there what our values were, what our priorities were in putting these together. Here is the map of where our research projects were. And then if you go to each one of these locations here, somebody asked in chat if they could get more information, for example, on the material that, I forget that who was asking. I think that Professor Mendez was doing. So you can click on his here on on his site. You can click on if you go to the slow violence, you can get not only to the promo video, but to the full video. And then here is some information, additional information on all of us. So I wanted to make sure we got that out. So, and again, what Edward has put the link in the website. So I'm going to stop sharing. Ralph, I'm going to give you a chance to make final comments for your presentation, and then we still have 30 minutes of our webinar. So hopefully most of you can still stay with us, and then we'll have conversation among ourselves. We will continue to make it possible for you to ask questions. There's a couple of questions I especially want the panelists to answer verbally that you've already posted. But with that, Ralph, just if you can spend a couple of minutes with your final wrap up of what it is that you were going to say before I stopped you.
No, sure. I'm actually no problem whatsoever. I have a ton of stuff to talk about. I think all of us do. And I think that's part of the richness of the entire project itself, all of them. I think I just wanted to say very quickly that we have a very strong, and this is just starting right now, but the curriculum development with students, very sophisticated kind of weather data, weather stations that we are deploying, balloon launches, all of this in service of a curriculum that we want to do at Albizu Campus. I will say finally that this sort of relationship between scientists and communities has not been an easy relationship, quite frankly. There have been some sticking points. A lot of it has to do with just simply the abstractions of scientific discourse and how communities make sense of that discourse, or actually have not much reason for having those kinds of discussions at times. What communities want are solutions. What the scientists are not necessarily able to offer are solutions. They're able to offer data. Nevertheless, it's these kinds of collaborations, I think, that need to kind of transform our relations actually between science and community. So at least Crocus has been trying to do that work. I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you, everyone. A big applause to everyone. What I'd like to do now, though, is go ahead and have us have some conversation among the groups, among the researchers. But before I do that, though, I want to be sure and have Rosa address the question that came up. Rosa and Natalie, how is using your art mapping visual ethnography as a methodology? How did you choose that methodology? How did participants respond to this artistic creative format of collecting information and stories from the community as opposed to interviews? So just speak a little bit more about the methodology. And in fact, I'm going to ask each one of you to speak about the methodology. Because if you notice, there was variation across the projects on the ways in which we got information to highlight the points, the experiences, and the points of view of Latino communities themselves. So Rosa and Natalie, if you want to address that first.
Sure. So yeah, so I had used this methodology before in other research projects. And one of the things that I think works out really well is that, you know, when you're asking people, especially questions about climate change, it's really, really difficult sometimes for people to really think through what they want to talk about. But by inciting them to draw what their experience has been, there seems to be a much better way for people just to put in paper, right? What their thoughts are. The way that we combine each session is that people were sitting in groups, and that also allows then for the researcher to move around the tables and then write a lot of participant observation, because very rarely are people drawing and staying quiet, right? So that's a really interesting part of this dynamic. Usually while people are drawing, they're showing their drawings to each other, and then a lot of rich conversation comes out of what they're sharing. So that's another set of opportunity, not only to collect what they're thinking about through what they're drawing, and then we ask them to also write up what the drawings meant, so that we were not sort of like analyzing, you know, those drawings and coming up with our own way of understanding them. And so there is a lot of rich ethnographic data that came from participant observation as well.
Thank you. And Ariana, you did some participant observation as well as some interviews. Do you want to just say a little bit about your methodology?
Yeah, I think I just also want to, after I heard the presentations of my colleagues, I wanted to just say that we studied very different Latino communities across the regions. And I want to use the term spectrum of vulnerability to environmental justices. So in the case of my project, I focus on informal communities that are invisible and hidden in the periphery of US cities, but they are present, and it is a widespread phenomenon. So we had to use like several methodologies such as mapping to uncover these informal subdivisions, and then choose an illustrative example that help us understand the interactions between environmental injustices and informal subdivisions. More importantly, data on these communities, on these peripheral communities, is poorly collected, even for the US Census or any publicly available data set. So because there is no good data, researchers that like us have to develop our own data sets and information to understand these interactions. So that requires us to conduct participatory action research that are typical of planning, such as household surveys, in-depth interviews, but also in order to build the relationships of trust between residents and researchers like us, because just you can imagine that residents of Springville don't trust researchers or city officials. So you need to build these relationships so people participate. It's a challenge. So that's why we needed to use participatory action research, build relations with them, attend community meetings, and then we did oral histories and photo voice, but it took a long time. So this type of research requires a long period of time. So we are very thankful that Crossing Latinidades allows to conduct 2-year research, including 2 amazing researchers, Josh and Bernardo.
And thanks for mentioning Josh and Bernardo. One of the things that I wanted to also point out about this Crossing Latinidades initiative is that it's also meant to be something that trains students on and giving them access to work alongside professors on research projects. So we are not the only Crossing Latinidades project. And in fact, I'm really pleased that Olga Herrera has joined us for this webinar. She's been on since we started here this morning or this afternoon, and she's the executor, if you will, of this project in bringing together the various sites, and simultaneously acknowledging also both Nana Torres and Amalia Payares, who were the principal investigators who obtained the funding from Mellon Foundation. So one of the big outcomes, besides the individual projects, is the training of the whole array of graduate students. And so you just mentioned to Ariadna that were very important to the work that you did. You also mentioned this concept of invisibility, right? We obviously know that we're not invisible to ourselves, but when it comes time to policy, the certain populations are, to quote Michael Mendez in his response here, are rendered invisible. Michael, do you want to just sort of address that point a little bit, and then from there talk about your own methodology and the work that you did?
Sure. Thank you again, and also want to highlight the 3 graduate students that I worked with closely on this project. Alexia Palomino, who's also at UIC, and then my 2 PhD students at UC Irvine, principally Carlo Changa Pizarro and then Claudia Valencia. So as I mentioned before, and I hope you'll be able to look at our individual websites, including my own, that we have a combination of different types of research methods and research outputs that entail data mapping, air quality modeling, archival research, and of course, the interviews, ethnographic interviews that you partly saw in that documentary video. And we wanted to take an approach of synthesizing all that sort of what is often called convergence research, where you bring very disparate different types of academic and expertise disciplines together and working on a very contentious or pressing societal need. So through that process, we wanted to kind of just show some of the key top lines and highlights of those impacts. But specifically for this documentary, we wanted to highlight about how undocumented Latino indigenous migrants, which are often considered one of the most not only marginalized, but one of the most stigmatized populations in our society, are often rendered invisible. They're obviously not literally in the sense invisible. Many of them have been living in these communities for years, if not decades, and we highlight that in our research. But they're rendered in terms of public policy, disaster policy, climate change policy, invisible, because not by accident or somebody forgot. It's because of intentional political choices that policymakers, disaster relief organizations, mainstream environmental organizations have intentionally done to withhold or exempt these undocumented migrants from disaster preparedness knowledge and recovery resources. So that's why we wanted to highlight the intentionality of these policies that render these populations invisible and the text of plans and programmatic benefits and outcomes. And we have worked with various migrant serving organizations throughout the state. It convened policy workshops, served as academic advisors. And so our next sort of line of research is not just focusing on the individual population themselves, but also the stress and the mental health toll that these migrant serving organizations are now experiencing by providing additional services and assistance that they weren't set up to do. Particularly on the impact of secondary or vicarious trauma of the continual, particularly in a place like California, where it's multiple disasters, not only year by year, but season by season, that happens and puts additional strain on organizational capacity, but also on the individual worker that's experienced that secondary and vicarious trauma. So happy to talk a little bit more about sort of the policy aspects that we're doing. We're also engaging on these human stories that we really wanted to focus on. I come to academia as a second career, spent many years in Sacramento in the state capitol working on public policy, environmental policy, and really understanding this idea of messaging and like human-centered stories. And that in my experience and research also documents this, that the biggest method, one of the strongest methods to influence policymakers is putting that human face, humanizing the issue, going away from abstract ideas and concepts of impacts that are happening to the general population or abstract communities, but again, putting that human face. So in our research, along with the quantitative convergence research that we do with air quality scientists and other public health scholars, we're also putting that human ethnographic face to that work.
And I think that is something that was characteristic of all the projects across the sites, right? Is this focus, just like you said, on this humanistic aspect of it. And speaking of students, I don't want it to go unsaid that we have our website thanks to the wonderful, wonderful work, and we just love working with this young man, Young Sok, Edward Chion. Edward, thanks to you, we do have this wonderful website that we're able to launch today. So we thank you. You will see when you go through it how facile it is, what a great website it is. So we thank and acknowledge you. We're going to come back at the end. There's a question in the chat asking us about how students can work alongside researchers to do this kind of work. So we'll finish with that question. But Professor Haverlock, let me go to you. Our methodology was a little bit different. In terms of how we brought folks together to sort of bring forward those voices. But as you talk about that, though, talk also about what did we really learn, and not only from ours but from the other sites. What are we learning about how climate change can be addressed? What's even as we compare the various sites? And this is going to be a question for all of us, I think, as we get into a discussion here.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll jump to what Ralph was saying about this kind of mismatch that can occur between what a community wants from researchers and what researchers come ready to offer. And, that is, of course, Ralph's scenario is specific to that project, but this is not uncommon, and it's also not unfounded. There are really rough traditions of researchers going into frontline and environmental justice communities, and it's often described as a kind of extractive relationship, right? I'm here to ask you about your experiences, to collect data, I'm going to publish it, I'm going to get grants, I'm going to get awards. And community members are well aware of these traditions. And I think, quite significantly making new demands. And the demands really range from true partnerships that are sustained with equity and with questions about, what each party is giving, what each party is getting. There are demands to really conceive shared research questions so that a research project can be more responsive to what the community is experiencing. And there are also demands for research to be community-led. And I think that is quite profound, because the promo video that we showed today that you can see in the longer video, that was a panel of really formidable, really creative, and really impactful environmental justice leaders on our campus doing the teaching. And so I think that, back to this question of what are we learning about climate change research, I think it kind of begins rooted in humility, that we might be researchers and we pay a lot of attention to our methods, but it's also very equally, maybe even more important, that we pay a lot of attention to our relationships, and we let these relationships like be generative and break through academic discourse, to really kind of produce frameworks and solutions and approaches that communities need. And so in many ways, you know, I think this academic research, I'm kind of having like a midwife imagery. You know, it's almost for us to kind of like deliver the visions, the solutions, the desired futures that are coming out of communities experiencing legacy and contemporary pollutions. And from my own experiences on this project and working with EJ leaders, I think that's exactly what we need. I think in an environment globally increasingly informed by misinformation, you know, it's really for us to bring students and partners back to this material lived reality and see what we share, see the disproportionate burdens, and kind of, you know, really have that storytelling, communication, research, solutions, partnership grow out of both that shared material reality and that acknowledgement of such disparate experiences of something like the same river.
And any of you can jump in at any point, but as I turn to Ralph to first for this question. So this was a grant through it was a humanities grant. The idea is to look at climate change issues through this humanities lens. Ralph, you're a philosopher, right? Your focus has been through the humanities, and yet you found yourself working on this very much science-based project. And how do you see that relationship between the humanities and science, particularly in addressing something like climate change and climate change as it affects Latino communities?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. First of all, yeah, I've always been a bit of a philosopher, a bit of a rhetorical theorist, but I've always done ethnographic work. So in this case, I've always been very close to doing research within communities themselves, particularly since I came to Chicago, up in Humboldt Park. But the question that you're asking is, I think when the scientists came in, I was very interested in how they were putting together the data itself, how they were going to gather it. And for them, the big question was, how do we get the communities to lead not the data gathering so much, but to lead the decision making? And these are themes that Rachel has just been talking about. That was very, very awkward. The scientists wanted, let me put it this way. Numerous meetings over Zoom in which community members are listening to the scientists talk, but to the ears of the community members, the science talk was gibberish, quite frankly. They were talking about aerosols. They were talking about chemistry, how the chemistry of the atmosphere was reacting to the chemistry of aerosols. And what the community wanted to hear was, we have a flooding problem. How do we do something about flooding? And those became very difficult conversations, to the extent that the community members just really started to drop off, and they stopped participating in the conversations. There was another moment in which, and I have this on my website, I talk a little bit about it, but to also capture what Rachel was saying, there was a moment in which a very large meeting, in-person meeting, was occurring, and one of the scientists said, we have to act with intellectual humility. In other words, knowing that all of the data that they were gathering was not necessarily relevant to the communities, and that they had to figure out different ways of communicating. And then there was another moment where a very famous scientist actually says, he finally came to the conclusion, kind of self-realization perhaps, that science without action is useless. And I think that is kind of perhaps where we are finally. In other words, the whole science establishment, the history of science, the history of the philosophy of science has been kind of geared to one thing. In other words, kind of figure out what nature is all about. But this is no longer adequate in terms of the sort of moment that we are entering into. And so that need that science has to rediscover what its relationship is to the society, what its relationship is to marginalized communities, that has been the internal struggle between the scientific community, many of them coming from Argonne, and the communities such as Humboldt Park and some of the other, other communities in Chicago where the data gathering is occurring. Does that start to explain your answer to the question?
No, that's fantastic. And I'd love to hear any of the rest of you respond to that, because how did our, how does our humanities lens, that focus on sort of people and how this is affecting people and the sort of the cultural aspects and so on, how does that intersect with not only the sciences, but with policy? I guess in a way, what was the value of having used this humanities lens as a window into looking at some of these issues that not only have they have scientific indicators, right, but are also manifested in real life measurable kinds of impacts. Is there anything you guys just want to say as it relates to humanities?
Yeah, I want to say that for me, like, we have to draw our research perspective from the perspective of environmental justice and humanities, because environmental justice comes from a social movement. And who else but residents of marginalized communities know the struggles? And so I think that by highlighting their stories, their solutions, and their experiences, researchers like us will be able to understand or provide a more nuanced understanding of research. And then I believe that researchers should be the facilitators between residents, community-based organizations, local stakeholders assisting the community, and governments to envision solutions that are drawing from their solutions and perspectives and doing that bottom up, not top down. Because otherwise we will be like technocratic researchers and implementing solutions that don't make sense for the community and will fail overall. So I think that only humanistic methodologies provide these relationships with the people, and so we have to use it. However, most of the research of environmental justice, you don't use humanistic methodology. So that's I believe is our contribution to this project to science and policy.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I can add
Please, Natalie, if there's anything you want to add, please feel free. Go ahead, Rosa.
Yeah, really quickly, that I agree with what it has been said. I think, like for me, the walking out with this acknowledgement that for researchers, we need to prioritize climate research that leads to climate action, right? In the context of particular places and culture. But also I think it's important, and maybe, we don't think about this too much, is to sit down with the communities beforehand, right? And help us. They should be the ones helping us to come up with the questions that the research wants to ask, right? Because a lot of the time, even when we want to, and the intention is to engage the community, a lot of the time we're walking into those community and those organizations already with the question that the research. And I think it will be much more productive and more oriented to climate action if those questions are generated between the researchers and the community members, especially the environmental justice leader working on this work.
Go ahead, Natalie, we're going to say something because I know Michael wants to say something.
Yeah, just really briefly, to kind of like support what Rosa said, but also to kind of answer one of the questions that was posted in the Q&A about what can students be doing. I think like across the board, all of our projects really speak to how in depth our understandings and lived experiences of climate change are as Latina communities. But I also think a big part is like, right, like us as researchers and academia, we're not the first ones to see these disparities or to be making these connections. Communities are already organizing, especially if you're local to Chicago. Environmental justice organizations exist all over the city. More than likely where
All
you
over the
live.
country.
Yeah,
All
all
over
over the
the country.
country.
All over the
Exactly.
world.
Yes, literally, like this work is happening. And I think if you're wanting to get involved, I think the first step is literally looking into your local community, kind of deciding like, what are your assets? What's your positionality? What can you offer to these organizations? But also, what do organizations need from you? Particularly within EJ work. And I think that's a big part too, is that sometimes people just need you to show up. And maybe that's where you start often. And then from there, you can get connected to folks and you make those connections. And then from there, if you are interested in more traditional formal research, you're able to make those connections with knowing that you're doing that work based off what the organization needs of you and not what they assume that they need from you. So I just wanted to say that really quickly.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. Michael and then Ralph.
Yeah, no, I think what everyone's saying is quite important, but I just want to also bring us back to sort of the political moment we are in, where climate change is going to be something that local communities are going to continue to fight. They have always been fighting on these issues, no matter what administration's in power in Washington, D.C., but there's going to be less support at the federal level. Millions of dollars were coming into environmental justice communities. But with that in mind, my project and Ariana's project largely focused on rural and suburban communities, which is quite different from a place like urban Chicago or urban Los Angeles, even. And even in places like California, the agricultural rural migrant communities are quite conservative or have different ideas of what environment and environmental protection means. So I think we really need to emphasize when we work with local communities around climate change, particularly in politically purple or different types of contexts of the language we use, of the framing, that human-centered approach, and how you focus on outcomes. Because many of these communities, as we saw in the last 2 weeks, are dealing with multiple priorities. Being able to pay for food because the cost of inflation, being able to pay for their gas to go to work because of the high cost of inflation, utilities, or even finding a job, or worried about them losing the job and getting laid off. So understanding that climate change and these disparate impacts, while they're great, are happening alongside other social economic disparities. And how can we focus on those outcomes, and how climate change reaches across those different types of priorities and concerns that local residents have, and voters as well. So thinking about how to reach these communities and really showing on outcomes and the benefits that climate action provides to Latino communities. And I think that's quite important.
Great, thank you. Ralph, you literally have 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'll just say it very quickly. These issues are very, very complicated. We started to prove that there's heat. Then the solution came up, well, tree canopies, but then it turns out that some trees have asthma. Humboldt Park has high rates of asthma. And then some community members were refusing trees because they thought that the roots were going to chew into the pipelines, the underground pipelines, or the trees were going to fall on their houses. These become very complicated conversations between communities and what data scientists are beginning to, put together.
Well, as you can see, we could talk quite a bit longer on our research. And one of the really exciting things that happened to us it happened among, I don't know if I say it happened to us, right? It happened among us, right? But it happened to Ariadna, right? Which, as you can see, that she is brought onto the screen, the newest addition to our research team. Ariadna, do you want to introduce your beautiful baby? She just had this baby in August.
Yeah, so he's Michael Jimenez. Yeah, so very happy. And I think I have 2 babies during the crossing Latinidades, Isaac and maybe Michael. So thank you for the support.
So with that, we really want to thank all of you for taking the time and the attention to be with us today. We've reposted the link for the website. Please feel free to use the website as much as possible, use those resources. We really have done this as a way to really promote the topic of climate change, climate justice, and the various disparate impacts on Latino communities, and the ways in which many people have and are coming together to address these issues. So again, thank you so much, all of you, for attending. We genuinely appreciate it.
Thank you, Teresa, for leading this.
It's been great. Edward, how do we stop recording? Oh, there we go. Never mind, I figured it out.